Imagine if you could take your favorite poem from centuries long ago and turn it into an award-winning short film. Well, you don't have to imagine anymore because I have done that, and in this video I'm going to show you how I did it and how you can do it too. Here are the top 10 screenwriting and storytelling and also filmmaking lessons that I learned from adapting the poem called Annabel Lee into a short film. So I've always really been a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. When I was in undergrad and it was time to do my senior thesis, kind of like my senior project film, I was like, well, what if I could find an Edgar Allan Poe story or poem and turn that into a short film? And so that's what I did. I found my favorite poem called Annabel Lee, and I adapted that and turned it into a script and then a short film. And that short film went on to win a lot of awards and screen not just in the United States, but also in Germany and in Finland and in Israel. So you've got to think about two different approaches to adapting a poem into a short film, no matter when the poem was written, okay? You've got the tone-based adaptation, in which the film itself, the short film, can be called a tone poem. And you've also got the narrative journey type poetic adaptation. So with a tone poem short film, there's little to no story element. It's very montage based, and it is focused completely on evoking the emotion that the reader gets from reading the poem, right? And so having any kind of narration and even talking about the poem itself is optional. Whereas with the narrative journey type adaptation of a poem into a short film, there's actually story structure to it. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. It's much more cinematic in that there's real scenes and not just montages. Doesn't mean you can't have montages, it just means there's going to be sequences. And it usually focuses on evoking a theme rather than just an emotion, okay? And a lot of these types of poetic adaptations will also include the narration of the poem into the story, but you don't have to. So you've got to figure out for your poem that you want to adapt into a short film, which style of adaptation fits better for that poem. Some poems are going to work real well as tone poem short films, and then other poems are going to work much more as narrative-based adaptations. One thing that I want to warn you against is showing the narrator. It can be kind of tempting, especially when you're focused on a short film that's based on a poem, to think, oh, well, I need to have somebody in the film saying the poem to the camera. I mean, you can have the narration, but I would caution you against actually including a narrator character in the film, all right? And what I mean by that is somebody whose only purpose in the story is to tell the poem. It's okay if the character that's in the film is the one who wrote the poem, but you shouldn't have somebody just sitting around a campfire just telling the poem, right? Then that's really more just kind of a fancier way to record the poem than to actually adapt it into another medium. I am the narrator for Annabel Lee, but I'm not on screen. Now, I want you to make sure when you're doing your adaptation, you're taking the poem and turning it into a screenplay, that you explore the imagery that's there. One of the big things about poetry is its sounds, especially the rhythm and the rhyme and the intonation and the feeling that come from that. But with a short film, you're trying to turn those elements into visual elements. You're trying to take the feelings and sounds and turn it into images. And so you want to kind of just let your mind explore and do a lot of research, whether it's on Pinterest or Google Images or just drawing or anything, to try to figure out what images do these words bring to my mind. And, you know, while you do want to try to portray the visuals that are in the poem themselves, because things are being described, you also want to explore things that are related but might not necessarily be in the poem itself. And that'll make your adaptation a lot richer. And you should also try to make sure that you're still expressing the feelings that are in the poem and not just the literal words, okay? And another thing that I want you to do as you're exploring this kind of potential imagery that your short film can have is figure out what inspired the poem, if you can. Usually poems are not they don't exist in like a creative vacuum, just like other types of literature. There's going to be existing motifs or symbols or cultures that these poems are built upon. And so if you explore those, that'll give you a much richer foundation to build your script on. Another thing that I would encourage you to do, which really helped me when I made my adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's poem, is when the poem was over, the film didn't end. I kept the story going beyond the stanzas, so to speak. So there's things that happen a little bit before the poem begins. It's kind of, I extrapolate based on what's in the poem into what I think happened, so to speak, as if it were a semi-real event. It is kind of a fantasy take on the poem, but I've also got stuff happening before, and then, especially after the poem ends, the short film keeps on going. So you do want to try to remain faithful to the source material, but that doesn't mean you're kind of like bound to staying in that source material. You can expand on the themes, expand on the imagery, and feel free to have things go beyond what's written, especially if it's from a narrative perspective. Another thing that you really need to do, especially if you're doing the narrative journey type poetic adaptation into a short film, is you need to focus on world building. Some poems are going to take place just in the regular world, but most of the time you can heighten the tone and the feeling of the poem by the setting in which you put the film version. That can give you some hints as to where you want to place the setting of the film, if you want to make it different than what's in the poem, or even if you just have to create it out of thin air. Maybe the poem that you pick has a story to it, but it doesn't have a particular setting or a particular country or time period. You can look at the themes that you do have and the emotions that you do have, and then pick kind of a world and create a world that would mesh well, and that you can that would expand upon those things that you already know about. It's not just a simple process of, here's a poem, and I'm going to put it in screenplay format, and I'm going to get some actors and go film it. There's so much more that goes along to it, but if you put in the work, then you'll get a result that you can be proud of, and will actually be a real emotional experience for the viewer, just like if somebody is reading the poem for the first time. Now you might be thinking, okay, I've got this poem, I've got these images, I've figured out where I want to set it. Do I actually have to write a script? You have to write a script. Poems are not screenplays, and so you need to actually write a script. By forcing yourself to put in the work of writing the screenplay, it'll actually make your film better. And of course, because you're going to be turning this into a film and not just keeping it as a poem, if either you or some other people or group of people is going to actually film this adaptation and actually get it produced and directed and edited and all that, then they're going to need a blueprint to go off of. So that's one of the obvious reasons why you need a script. But even if you're making it yourself and you've got it all in your head, I challenge you, write a script. Don't just go on the poem, actually turn it into a script, because it'll make the process that much better. This is optional, but this is something that really helped when I did my adaptation. And it goes all the way back to not just how we filmed the film Annabelle, but also how I structured the screenplay. There's no dialogue, all right? I wrote the script without dialogue, and so that also meant that we were able to shoot on set M.O.S. So that means mute on sound, so it means you're not recording anybody speaking on camera. And this actually worked out really well because we were filming on the beach and it was really windy, and so it would have been really hard to record audio. One of the reasons why I did that is because the lyrical aspects of the poem itself were so powerful that I wanted to have the poem narrated while the story was taking place. The narrator is not shown on screen, but the film does have the narration of the poem while the story is playing out. And so shooting M.O.S, if it fits for your story, is going to be a big benefit to you in making things really pop, especially if you want to focus on the words of the poem. If that's a strong component of your script, then plan ahead and write the script to where there's no dialogue so that you can shoot M.O.S. You got to bend, but not break. It was really hard to get this film made. This was a long time ago now, but when we actually shot the film, the weekend I was supposed to film was when Hurricane Sandy came through in 2012. So we're filming a period piece on the beach, and there's a hurricane. which put a whole bunch of stuff at risk. And we really had to scramble in order to salvage some of that weekend and then rearrange everybody's schedules and get them to come back the next weekend to finish filming. And we had to change a lot of the fight scenes, the fight choreography, and all this kind of stuff happened. I've got a lot more detail on all the stuff that went along with the filming and more details that go along with how I structured the screenplay and how I structured the story. I've got details for that in the article in the description below. So if you want to dive deeper into some of these things that I'm talking about, then definitely check out the article after you watch the film. And you can't watch the film until after you watch this video, so sit tight. Finally, this is something that I tried to do with my short film adaptation, but I didn't really do such a great job of it, and that's why I really want to tell you to engage with the community around your poem. There's a ton of fans everywhere of Edgar Allan Poe, and I tried to kind of connect with them when I was making the film, and especially after I made the film, but I didn't do such a great job. And if I could change one thing, that's probably one of the things I would change. I wonder if I would change the hurricane. I think I could have gotten a lot more kind of notoriety around the film and could have gotten more investors in it and all these things, because it's a very famous poem from a very famous author. And even though the film is now a bit more popular on YouTube and it even got distributed, I still think I could have done a lot better with that. And so if you are adapting the poem that has a big following, or the poet is very famous, then that's something you should definitely leverage. Okay, that's something you should definitely leverage. And the same thing when you're going onto the film festival circuit. You need to target specific film festivals. You need to target the ones that are in your area, and you need to target the ones that would have an affinity for the type of story that you're telling. So, for example, I focused on the type of festivals that liked fantasy and liked dark subject matter because it was an Edgar Allan Poe poem, and I had done a fantasy adaptation of that poem, and it was period piece and all that stuff. So you really got to kind of tailor your festival strategy to the type of poem that you're going to adapt. And so if you can think about that stuff early on, that'll really help you. So to summarize, if you're going to adapt a poem into a short film, here's the stuff you need to keep in mind. Is it going to be a tone-based adaptation or a narrative-based adaptation? Make sure that you don't show the narrator, okay? You can have narration, but don't have the person sit around a campfire and tell the poem to the camera, because that's just kind of not very creative, all right? Explore the imagery that's in the poem, because that's going to give you a firmer foundation and allow you to expand what you show in the script so that it can build on those themes and emotions that are already there. Expand beyond the poem. Especially if your poem is narrative-based, try to figure out what happened before the poem started and what happens after the poem ends. And that can kind of make your film feel like a more complete kind of narrative entity. Make sure that you build a world for your characters and your poem to inhabit, because that'll build on the themes and emotions that are at play. Make sure that you write a script, all right? Write a script. Don't just go off the poem. You actually got to write a script, and it'll actually make the product a lot better for you. If it fits for your story and it fits for your poem, then write your script without dialogue so that you can shoot M.O.S. and not have to worry about sound when you're on set. And that's going to be especially helpful if you're not very experienced with film production, or if you don't have a big crew or a big budget, things like that. When stuff happens and stuff goes wrong on set, like a hurricane coming through, bend but don't break. You know, safety is key, but then after the storm is gone or the things have been overcome, you can come back together and make sure that you get the film made, all right? Engage with that poet's community, especially if it's a famous poem or a famous poet, or particularly a famous subgenre. Then try to rally those fans around your story, because they might not know who you are, but they probably know who that poet is, all right? And finally, keep all of these things in mind as you're targeting specific film festivals so that you can have a better chance of your poetic adaptation making a splash. If you follow those tips, then you will be in a great place to make your first poem into a short film. If there's a poem that you're thinking about doing, then let me know down in the comments, and let me know if you've been able to find an adaptation that's already been done before. It's okay if somebody's already done an adaptation. You can still do one yourself. Just make sure if you are going to adapt a poem that it's that you get permission from the author if it's still copyrighted. One of the reasons I could do an Edgar Allan Poe poem is because everything that he wrote is now in the public domain, and so there's no copyright issues to worry about. You can watch my short film, Annabelle Lee, in its entirety by clicking right here. And then after you've watched Annabelle Lee, you can also check out the honest trailer that my friends and I made and have a real laugh at all the inside jokes that my friends and I had from making the film, being on set, and being a part of the world of Annabelle Lee.